Why did you decide to write this book?
One of the critical lessons that I took from 1991 was the enormous amount of time invested in the preparation of the armed forces between 1975 and 1990, across the board in all of the armed forces, but especially in the United States Army. Some of your viewers will remember that things were not good in the aftermath of Vietnam. And we were fortunate to have some general officers who had actually served in the Second World War. And they set out to build a new army that could take on, at the time, the Soviet armed forces because they were presumed to be the most likely enemy. And their modernization went hand in hand with the organizational construct and enormous effort in training and bringing in better quality soldiers, sergeants, lieutenants, and captains, and giving them the right training and experience to make them effective. And that taught me something. And I then decided when I wrote this book, I'm going to go back and look at what has happened in the last 100 years. Not because I think the previous several thousand are not important, but the 20th century is close to us. And most of what we're dealing with right now is fallout from that century.
Absolutely.
And what you find is a similar story in each case. Decisions made 10, 15, sometimes 20 years in advance that influence how you fight, how you organize, how you think about warfare, the technologies that are chosen for integration into the force, and then finally the quality. Now, I'm talking about soldiers, sergeants, lieutenants, and captains, of individual soldiers, as well as that construct for command, how you integrate at a high level, particularly in this case, I'm talking about the operational level, just below the strategic, and then the strategic decisions that lead to the war. National culture plays a major role in all of this. Each nation treats its military differently and treats the challenges of preparing for war differently.
Before I begin this case study, I first have to establish some basic definitions. The word strategy itself is derived from several Greek words. Strategos, meaning general of an army, strategia, generalship or command of an army. Although archaic in form, it does serve as a reminder for those watching this video to understand the historical roots of today's topic of discussion. The modern definition of strategy is extremely varied. This is due to the fact that the term strategy has been applied to everything from war games to business to finance and everything in between. For the purposes of this video, we will go with the broadest, well-accepted definition, that of applying means to achieving ends. Means meaning tools and resources. These resources can take many forms and are not restricted to material items such as logistics and ammunition, but also to people and ideas. Ends refer to objectives, whether they be long-term or short-term. It is defined by what the overall outcome is being sought after. There is a book called On Grand Strategy, written by a historian by the name of John Lewis Gaddis. I read this book when I was 18, and it has stuck with me ever since. In the first chapter of this book, Gaddis explains the key difference between strategy and grand strategy. Now, grand strategy is not too much different from strategy. Its definition is relatively the same, except for one key factor: scale. In wargaming, true grand strategy is very rarely exercised. Games that claim to be grand in nature at the end of the day are only weak imitations of what they claim to represent. Grand strategy wargames by their nature cannot conform to their real-life counterparts, but once again Foxhole breaks all preconceived notions. The successes of the 4th Naval Division in Wars 108 and 109 can be traced back not by days, but months and years prior to the formation of the Reggie. There were decisions made that influenced the outcome of battles that had not even been conceived in thought. Some of these decisions were made through careful calculations, others were made due to how the cards were dealt at the time by the universe. But they were decisions nonetheless that had very real consequences. I will trace back and explain every major decision that was made, whether by me or others, that eventually resulted in the outcomes of the battles fought by the 4th in Wars 108 and 109. I will point out to the successes as well as the failures, and hope somebody might learn something useful. To explain where this philosophy of the regiment began, we've got to go all the way back to my very first major operation. It was War 25 on Baker Shard, and things weren't going well. Colonial forces were on the back foot, and Colonial High Command, which was Baker's version of Sigil, came up with a daring offensive to try and change the tide of the war. The plan called for 2 nukes to be simultaneously launched straight into 2 Warden Logihexes. The primary attack would consist of almost 100 men, which would break through and bypass the main Warden line and set up a defensive position just in range of Longstone so that their spotter could get the coordinates to nuke the MPF. My regiment, the 753rd, would insert a small recon team to a secondary target with no support. The idea was to use the primary attack as a diversion for our own secondary attack, and utilizing the elements of stealth and surprise, we would get both nukes off in quick succession. Although great in theory, and it makes for a good story, the whole operation was never going to succeed. Despite that this operation was in the works for almost a whole week, there was literally no real effort made by anybody in any of the units involved as to the feasibility and, more importantly, the details of this operation that would have made it successful. If you want the full details of this mess, you can go watch my after action report, but to sum it up, the main attack of 100 men failed to break through the correct place and time, and gave the enemy the opportunity to counterattack. Our own 753rd attack had next to no recon or intelligence for this op, an op which pretty much depended solely on recon and intel, as we weren't going to have support when we called in the missile strike. The only reason we got as far as we did, which was pretty close mind you, was because one crazy guy decided to spend 8 hours of his time to try and get the operation done at the last minute. This guy had only 50 hours clocked into the game at this point. He had done nothing but logi. He hadn't even been in a firefight. His only combat experience was chasing down partisans in the backlines of the Jeep. The weeks of grinding by so many people in the 753rd boiled down to one rookie who had to carry this shit show to the finishing line. And even then, we only failed by a 5-minute window. But that guy is yours truly, and I was pretty pissed off by the whole thing. Now, just to make it clear, I didn't do it because I had completely lost my marbles, although it may have been a contributing factor, come to think of it. But I did it because I was a logi guy, right, at the time. All the guys that grinded out this nuke were the folks that I spent most of my limited time in the game with. I wasn't a recon or combat-oriented player. I wasn't really interested in those things at the time. But I recognized the amount of work put in by these people that I knew was just too damn high to be thrown out the window due to the incompetence of our leaders. That was the reason why I did it, right? Not for glory or recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. And just to reiterate how much effort was put in by these logi guys, for many, this was both their first and last war. More than half the people in the Reggie burned out, and they never returned to the game after this operation. It was right after the operation that I wrote a short message and posted it into the officers' chat, and it laid out the basic premise that in Foxhole, people's time is the most precious resource. If you do not respect people's time, they will leave, and without people, you can't really achieve anything in this game. This single event would be the first fundamental building block for 4ND, and it would be the most significant concept that would enable our successes.
5.
I am on the screen and waiting for the code.
I am waiting for code as well.
Launch
Heads
code
up.
3100.
3100.
3100.
After War 25, I participated in War 26 on Baker and in War 4 on Charlie. These last 2 wars were very good learning environments as to the core mechanics of the game, namely that without people you can't do anything meaningful. The core ideas behind our emphasis on training and retaining players in 4th Naval Division can be traced back to these wars where I saw firsthand how servers died. But more importantly, it was in these wars that the first core group of players that would form the 4th Naval Division were being selected. Either consciously or subconsciously, I had already identified and pulled in members from 753rd and other supporting regiments all together to follow the core philosophy of not wasting time. And from here, many of the operational methods were being tested and developed that would ultimately be transferred over to the 4th Naval. Concepts of operating different vehicles and units together through effective communication systems, concepts of effective in-game leadership and command, ideas behind fighting through maneuver instead of attrition, All these core concepts were being developed and practiced in this period. Remember, the Navy update was no more than a rumor at this point in time, and all of the work being done here was to our benefit, for those who wanted a different experience in Foxhole than just blindly following incompetent fools into the meat grinder. But these decisions would still have long-term consequences, as we're about to see. After a short attempt at Able server, I took my first long break from the game, but still kept in touch with all the people I had previously mentioned. It was around this time the rumors of the Navy update were turning into something more than rumors. The decision to go back into the game if the Navy update was real was due to two main factors. One was obviously due to the increase of players into the player base. If this update was going to be as big as Inferno, then naturally the player base would get a massive increase. This prediction turned out to be 100% correct. With increased players, recruiting would be a walk in the park. Also, by making a regiment designed around the update itself, we would get the right people involved, people who were willing to try the naval aspects with us to the conclusion. Secondly was the question of culture. Now, I've already explained the don't waste time philosophy, but now I will explain another reason I was willing to bet big on this naval regiment plan. Most of the ineptitude in foxhole operations are due to people following the herd mentality. We had previously tried to influence others to try warfare through maneuver, but to no success. This was due to the culture that had already taken over the entire player base. No one was willing to see reason in a sea of madness. The Navy update would give us a one-time opportunity to try our ideas on the big scale. I was willing to bet that whatever naval update was to come, the devs would try to make it into an entire different theater of war. This turned out to be true, but only later did we realize it was very poorly implemented. But for Wars 108 and 109, the implementation was irrelevant. It was such a new idea and update that there would be room to indoctrinate new players into our way. It should be noted that the core group that was with me in these preliminary planning stages was still very unsure of my plan and my reasoning, which is a very good lesson to any future commanders. If you have to learn to keep your head on right when everyone around you fails to see. The decision to start the Naval Regiment at this point was the single most important conscious decision I made. Remember, all the previous decisions and actions made were for the sake of our don't waste time philosophy. They were not directly made to help with Navy gameplay, because we didn't know it at that time. But once the update was announced, you can see it did end up contributing significantly to the end results. The plan for 108 that I drew up was based on all the experience and ideas developed in the year prior to the update. The war plan was also designed around specifically set goals and objectives, which very few regiment commanders are capable of generating. Everything from the way we would recruit, train, build, and fight was built off a core foundation that was already combat proven. All that was missing were the people. And I think we got very lucky in this aspect because all the right people showed up at the right time during the dev server test. All the future department heads show up and got on board with the program straight off the bat. Recon, intelligence, logistics, and facility. Also present were the future veteran sea hands that would man the guns to victory. When you look at it in hindsight, it all seems perfect, but let me set the record straight. Ultimate success was still in the balance. Like I mentioned at the very beginning, good plans and theory only take you so far, but without credible, practical concerns for the details, nothing works. I made sure from the very start that I was a part of every aspect in the regiment, from logistics to facility to commanding of warships. This was necessary as this was a new organization. To be a good leader in this respect, you have got to share in the hardships the same way as the men do. Not only is this good practice, but when it comes to winning naval battles, this is necessary. Naval engagements last mere minutes, and yet the time required to even enable the battle in the first place can take days and sometimes weeks. To achieve victory, a price needs to be paid in time and resources, and it is a price very few people are willing to pay, and even fewer still know how to effectively pay it. The 4th Naval Division was one of the rare exceptions to all the rules, and was able to recognize the steps necessary for victory, and took them. In the war plan, I made it clear that every operation from the first gunboat sortie to our very first destroyer operation was to be methodical. If you want proof besides the words on the slides, you can watch the after-action reports. I broke down every play from every operation and explained why things happened the way they did and what needed to be done in the future. This rigorous attention to detail enabled us to improve at an extremely rapid pace. Another thing to note is the command culture that developed in the regiment. Most other regiments treat themselves as social communities who value democracy or other such nonsense. I made it very clear that the 4th was no democracy, and that if you sailed with us, you had better be ready to get to work. If the logic guys were going to grind for 10 hours, then the recon guys have got to put in their own share of the load. And I, as the commander, had better be mentally prepared to execute when the time comes, whenever that may be. The major battles we fought at Java Sea and Godscroft were all a combination of the hard work we all collectively put in together as a regiment. The outcomes of these battles were not clear-cut or determined by God. They turned out the way they did because some men decided to go beyond what the community deemed possible. They believed in something that was greater than themselves. As I stated at the very start, some of the decisions that affected the overall outcome were not made by me or anyone else. They just so happened to occur due to the circumstances at the time. But there were many decisions made, whether with or without the foreknowledge of certain events to come, that ultimately paid off. I do not recommend anyone to try replicate these steps if it is even possible. The price paid by a commanding officer such as myself was extremely high. There's a damn good reason I burned out only after just 2 wars, and I think it's self-explanatory at this point. But there are some words that I've known for a very long time. These words are that members of great teams make personal sacrifices. I think everyone in the 4th at some point personally sacrificed something to the cause. I know for certain that my department heads for logistics, facility, and intelligence went above and beyond what normal players are willing to do. And I still like to think that they did it not because that's what others do in other normal regiments, but because they had faith that this endeavor was going to pay off somehow.